welcome everybody to High Density Housing Lessons from Sweden. We've probably got a couple of people still filtering in, but we may as well kick things off. My name is Matt Ward. I'm the publisher of Euro Publications and the owner of the little bookshop over in the corner here at Collingwood Yards. We are very happy to be able to host Rutger and Helen today in the launch, effectively the Australian launch of their new book, 14,495 Flats, a Metabolist's Guide to New Stockholm. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which Collingwood Yards is situated, the Wurundjeri people of the Woiwurrung language group. I'd also like to extend my respects to their elders past and present, and all First Peoples and elders past, present and future, in fact. My thanks to Shannon again of Composite for hosting us here today, and a huge thanks to the NGV for making this part of the program this year at Melbourne Design Week and Melbourne Art Book Fair. 14,495 Flats examines the multi-unit housing boom the multi-unit housing approved at the height of Stockholm's 2017 building boom in the midst of an ongoing housing shortage there. There are obviously some very strong parallels with Melbourne's own apartment building boom, which has probably been going now for a good decade, and has also been combined with a sort of perverse shortage of affordable housing and public housing generally. The critical questions the book grapples with are: what are the demands that this architecture answers to, and what problems of its own might it be wrestling with? What kind of life does it dream of accommodating, and who does it normalise, naturalize, or exclude? Really important questions, I think, for Melbourne, never mind Stockholm, of course. Helen Runting is an architectural theorist, urban planner, and urban designer. Her work insists that another world is possible and that an affirmative biopolitics, wherein bodies, minds, and environments are set in mutually supportive relation, is achievable. Drawing on critical theory and feminist scholarship, as well as ongoing engagement with the politics of architecture under late capitalism, Helen writes, critique, essays, and analyses of our shared architectural present. I'm going to stuff up your surname, Rutger. Sjögrim. Rutger is a practicing architect. He also teaches architecture, and he is our honorary Swede today. The only one here, I believe, that's actually from Sweden. Oh. Oh, okay. Well, in this global world, that counts, surely. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce the two of them. They're going to be giving a short presentation of about half an hour. Following on from that, we'll have a little break, 10 minutes or so, and then we'll invite the panellists up to the stage to discuss some of these issues, some of these burning questions. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks very much. Rutger, you're actually starting, aren't you?
I'm starting. Should we... How are we doing with the
I think
slides?
we'll sit down. I think that feels good if that's okay.
Let's see if I can.
You can tell me to push if you want.
Hello? Yes. All right. So we're here to introduce her to our book. But first, a little bit about us. Secretary. There you go. Secretary is an office for architecture, and it's Helen Runting, myself, and Karin. We started in 2017. Secretary is a research and development-oriented office, and we try to get that sort of research out into buildings such as this, which is student, kind of multi-residential building for students and older adults in Linköping, and it's being built right now. It's a collaboration between us and two other architecture offices called Sprid and Septembre. It's made entirely out of wood, and it's plus energy. This is a collaboration that we did last year together with Melbourne-based practice Sibling Architecture for the Future Homes competition here. And this is a landscape project for a park in Helsinki that we did together with an architectural practice called Brum. It got pretty good reviews by the jury, but their assessment or feasibility assessment team deemed it completely unrealizable, but we're quite proud of it. And this winter Swedish kind of counting or summer here, we designed this installation for M Pavilion, which is it's kind of a sun chair for many people made out of these physiotherapy rubber bands. So the technology used to build bodies are here used to suspend bodies in relaxation or play. But and we also do books, and that's why we're here. Do you want to?
I think that's my cue. So firstly, also thank you so much, Matt and Monica, for the possibility to be here, and also for the introduction and acknowledgement of the unceded nature of this land. So the first chapter then that we'd like to present in this short run through, I think Matt said half an hour, I think we planned 45, we'll see how we go, is entitled Ways to Stalk a Beast. So welcome to Stockholm, a city of just over 1 million people. If you haven't visited this capital of Sweden, if not marketed as the capital of Scandinavia against Copenhagen's will there, Stockholm's built on a really dramatic territory that's made up of an archipelago suspended between the Baltic Sea and the Lake Mälaren. This is a city, there's probably two things I can say in just introducing the context. This is a city that's divided in terms of its housing stock between rental, which is also rent controlled, apartments, cooperatively owned apartments or condos, and privately owned detached houses, what we refer to as villas in Swedish. And this book is about Stockholm, but I guess it's also important to say that it was also made there. It's a product of a fairly intensive urban development situation, a moment of economic boom. We wrote this book mainly from a small office that we rented in a former TV station on the edge of town, miles from the closest subway. And we did that because we just started our practice. The year was 2017, and the economic conditions that preceded our decision to start an office were hysterical, to say the least. There was a lot of money flowing through the economy, and there was a general acknowledgement of a housing crisis coming from the national government down to the municipalities. This resulted in the Swedish Association of Architects kind of coming out. This is one of their industry reports. So in 2017, they made the call that, this is going to sound strange when I translated, the locomotive is slowing. So we really did start the office at the worst possible time, just as the economic boom was coming to a close. Because in 2016, this was the cover of the previous market report, and it declares architects have become a limited resource. And that's really how it felt within the architecture scene. A lot of people were hitting the wall. A lot of people were suffering from stress issues. There were a lot of mouse arm physiotherapy kind of moments. Everyone was really quite deranged from exhaustion at this point. And we wanted to ask the question, what did this period result in? What had we achieved? And what had all these workplace injuries kind of been for? So here, obviously, I'm stealing from Madeleine Riesendorp, but I did want to use this image just to suggest that at the start, the project kind of took on a kind of psychogeography. We were interested in almost a psychoanalysis of the city that had been born out of these hysterical conditions. We wanted to know how it felt, and we wanted to know what kind of environment it might be for us to live in the future. I guess the problem with analysing architecture is that architecture comes in advance. We draw it and then it's built. So when you try to analyse an architectural present, you're analysing things that have not yet materialised, and you have to find technologies that are able to penetrate through the kind of womb space of urban planning in order to reveal what might become. And for us, this was a city, the book took 3 years, the study that it was based on took 3 years. It was funded by a hodgepodge of different grants that we applied for over that time, and a fair bit of unpaid labour late at nights and on weekends to get it finished. And the city that we were looking at was really one that was in a state of genesis. It was growing around us. It was rising from greenfield sites. This is my favourite Google image with the two people with their pram surrounded by gravel and construction waste. It was a kind of architecture that wasn't quite in place yet. So this is not a post-occupancy study. We tried to kind of, I guess, close our eyes and imagine what was about to arrive. And the technology that we used in order to do this was, of course, not an ultrasound. That would have been ridiculous. It was building permit plans. So much like the Australian system, architecture needs to be approved by our democratic systems in Sweden as well. And it's done so by a very archaic system where we apply a stamp to a piece of paper. As the Stockholm metropolitan area is made up of 26 municipalities. So our municipalities are a little smaller than the Victorian equivalents. And we approached these 26 municipalities with one question. Can you send us plans for all of the apartment buildings that were given approval for the year 2017? And we got back piles and piles digitally, obviously, of documentation. But what we were after were the ones that, as you can see, they've been scanned with the hole punches that had this stamp of approval. Because a stamp of approval is a magic thing. It means that this picture will become reality. It means that the dimensions that are documented will become real spaces in the future. And so we sat with this material and measured it in Adobe Acrobat. I do not ever recommend this methodology to anybody, ever, ever, ever. Do not ever do this. But at that stage, I don't think that there was an algorithm that would have been able to kind of read these plans because the material was just so diverse. So we documented quantitative and qualitative measurements. We're not generally a quantitative research practice, so this was very new for us. We had to learn how to do math. Over these late nights and weekends and many weeks, we filled our spreadsheet with 17,000 data points. And when we went through this pile of material that we'd been given, at the end of the day, the 26 municipalities sent us planning permit documentation for 154 projects, within which there were 337 apartment buildings. It's a little bit of a Swedish lesson here too. You get both languages. The book's also bilingual, which at the end of the day came down to 14,495 flats. If I'm honest, there might be 2 or 3 off there, I'm not sure. 33,000 rooms that would inhabit, if we go with today's norms, around 42,000 people. This is 1.2 million square metres of floor area. And interestingly enough, it was also the product of the labour of a very limited number of people in one way. It was 38 developers who were responsible for these projects and 88 architecture officers. The Swedish development industry is very heavily concentrated to the point of almost approaching monopolies. And here we see those projects spread out over the space of the region with its very unique topography. Most of the projects were actually along the commuter rail lines, which is good planning, and most of them happen within what we call a middle ring, which Rutger will return to later. So in trying to think through, I mean, obviously this is an insane undertaking. Why did we do it? I think that there was a real desire to produce an analysis of architecture that at a scale that's not only of the city but of the metropolitan region. This is a scale that we talk about in terms of an architecture in aggregate, and we explain it through this image. I was going to update this for a Melbourne audience with a French bulldog instead of a poodle, but I didn't have time. And we explain it in the following terms. We ask our audience and our readers, have you ever been to a dog show? It's not a normal way to start an architecture theory book, but has anyone been to a dog show? No, I have. So it's a really strange experience, like kind of turning up to a space and watching, 10, 12, 15 poodles standing in a line, all of them perfectly clipped, all of them very well behaved, and the judge has to choose one of them. And once you've seen this kind of this beast of 12 poodles together, seeing one is never really the same thing. It doesn't have the same impact. And you realise that as a composite beast, what you're witnessing is something entirely new. It's fantasy-like. It's sort of something between a dragon and a unicorn. And what we wanted to, obviously our book's not about dogs, it's about houses, but we wanted to apply this logic to architectural design and to try to understand what is it in aggregate when you look at all of it at once, and how can we produce the methods for looking at architecture in this composite way. So.
Okay. Part 2. So
do you want to control? Do you want to take that microphone?
Hello. Okay, so the book is laid out in 4 parts. The by far biggest one, that's almost the entire book, is this collection of floor plans that we've gathered from the municipalities. And then there's a sort of a data section, some diagrams and charts, which is this, we jokingly refer to it as artisanal data, because we've hand measured every single digit of it. So there might be some errors, but it has that air of authenticity to it. And preceding that, there's a section on typologies, where we try to sort of, if we think of this composite poodle shape of all the buildings, we're trying to sort of squint our eyes and look through all the plans at the same time and see if we can see typological kind of imprints that are either normative or divergent. So, like, what would be the norm, and what are the kind of the offshoot tendencies that break out from that? And before that, there's an introductory chapter, which is along the lines of what Helen just told you. And I will talk about kind of the two middle part here. So typologies, but before that, a little bit on the data. 14,495 flats, 33,199 rooms, a lot of inhabitants, and a lot of square meters. This first chart is about the apartment sizes, and more precisely, it's about how many rooms per apartment, kind of compared to the amount of apartments being produced. And so the first thing that's sort of striking is that in 2017, Stockholm approved permits for a lot of small apartments. 64% of all apartments are either studio apartments or one-bedroom apartments. And 57% of those, the inner ring on the right-hand side, are apartments that's permitted for one-person households, which means that they are either of 55 square meters or less in size.
I'd also just like to say that these amazing graphics that we're looking at were done by a Melbourne-based graphic designer, Tristan Main, who's in the room. We drove him absolutely insane in this project, so thanks for being here, Tristan.
This is the sort of the division of tenure forms within the multi-residential buildings. And about 30% of what was permitted was rentals, and a little more than 70% is this condominium co-op self-owned form of apartments. This diagram shows you kind of the average sizes of Swedish apartments. So studio apartments, the middle column in each cluster is the average size in square meters. So a studio apartment, the average studio apartment would be 33 square meters, an average one-bedroom apartment 50, and an average two-bedroom apartment 76. And then you have on the outside the sort of the average smallest and the average largest apartment per project, and then on the outside of those, they're really like the absolutely smallest and the absolutely largest. So the smallest apartment that was permitted in Stockholm 2017 was 19 square meters, and the largest one was 202.
I know which one I want.
This shows you like how the apartments are distributed across municipalities in Stockholm, which might not give you a lot of information if you don't know Stockholm. But what we can say is like the municipality of Stockholm is about 33%. And if we go back to the map, the municipality of Stockholm is this kind of stretched out shape in the middle. And then you have the other municipalities around. And looking at these municipalities, Stockholm is by far kind of the engine or the locomotive, as Helen, in terms of like producing apartments. But it's interesting to look at the sort of the right-hand side here, where we've mapped the sizes of apartments produced, either in relationship to the total amount of apartments or as a percentage. And then we can see a couple of the sort of suburban municipalities peaking when it comes to producing like a lot of small apartments. We can't tell you exactly why, but we could speculate it has to do with them having like a large concentration of single-family houses, for example, so it becomes more economically viable.
I think you need to have the microphone very close to your mouth, apparently, just so you know.
Okay. Yeah, the average plot size is about 5,000 square meters. Buildings are predominantly built on flat ground. Most of it is in residential areas. But this is a bit interesting, perhaps. Like the vast majority of all apartments are produced in typologies that have 3 or 4 apartments per stairwell and floor. And I will come back to this a little bit later with the typologies. But it's an incredibly strong norm in a Swedish context. The average height of a building is 6 stories, if we look at what was permitted. And also the ceiling height is clearly between 2.5 meters and 2.59 meters. So it's a little bit taller in terms of ceiling height than in the 80s, but it's fairly low, I can say. And these are the typologies we've looked at. And I will come back to those very soon. Yes, and this is the average house. This is what an average house in Stockholm looks like. It typically has a short tower block and a lamellar building. Yeah. So when we've been looking at typologies, we've been using a kind of a typological vocabulary that is typically used by Swedish architects, and that's very it's kind of defined in the mid-20th century. So it's very modernist, and it typically has like a lamellar building, a short tower block, or a kind of a larger slab building, and then kind of detached or like row house-looking typologies, and then various perimeter block forms. And to give... Sorry.
One could say that this is the toolkit that was used to construct the welfare state or the architecture of the welfare state between the 1950s through to maybe the 1990s.
And to give you a bit of an overview of how that looks like, this is the inner city of Stockholm. So this is the kind of the 19th to 20th century city. And this is sort of a modernist suburb south of Stockholm called Högdalen. And here you see the typical short tower blocks combined with what we call lamellar houses, which is this kind of lower linear buildings. And this, in a Swedish context, would be called a skivhus, so like a slab. And this is the kind of city that's being built right now in the suburb of Barkarby, north of Stockholm. More closer to the city, at the area called the Royal Seaport. And this is at the edge of the inner city. So when we're looking at these typologies, the idea is to think of them kind of as tendencies rather than fixed kind of types. taking the sort of the punkthus or the tower block as an example, you see one here at the edge of at the end of the street, and the same building in plan would look like this. This is from the 50s. These are contemporary examples, and what has happened is that they've sort of become a bit bigger, and they started to also get this kind of bulges. So like what was previously kind of a very quite strict contour and a strict kind of volume is now becoming a bit multifaceted. And if we kind of flip those down, this is what they look from the side. So there's also this tendency to articulate a building as if it's kind of made up of many smaller buildings. And looking at the lamellar house, the one to our left here, this is a typical kind of post-war 2 apartments per stairwell solution. It's quite slim. And here we can see a contemporary one. This is one of those 3 apartments per stairwell. That's so common. And typically you would have 2 apartments reaching both sides, and then kind of like a stomach bulge with like either one smaller apartment or 2 smaller apartments in. And these can, of course, be longer. And if we look at this house from the side, it's quite like a far step from the old modernist building. And we can even see more kind of denser or complex shapes, such as this, starting to form. And looking at that from the side, it's kind of like a wall of apartment buildings. And does anybody know this building? When I started architecture school, this was considered very cool. It's a Dutch building by MVR de V, and it's kind of like it's kind of the aesthetic of capital expressed as art. And now it's interesting to think that in Stockholm, these kind of typologies are almost kind of residually produced, like burped up along the streets. But this sort of brings us to the typological part, and we have kind of 3 typologies we're looking at, or I will show you in this presentation. They're like the range from larger to smaller, and this is the sort of the big oldest sibling of them. It's not the most common one. But it's quite indicative of a tendency that we've been seeing where buildings start to kind of dissolve a little bit in terms of shape and contours. But within the buildings, we can see quite clear and defined stairwell typologies. This building, which is a very big building, is part of an even larger kind of mega block next to the highway close to the inner city suburb of southern Stockholm. So it does, on one hand, it tries to produce an image of city. You know, like as many projects in Stockholm, it tries to dress itself up as consisting of many small buildings. But it also sort of shields the development from noise. So it also produces this wall, so to say. This is a typology building that's more centrally located, and it has a weird sort of candy cane shape that makes little sense when you just see it kind of popping up as a plan in a building permit.
At 2 o'clock in the morning in Adobe Acrobat.
This is how it looks, an aerial view, and it's a bit interesting because it performs a couple of typologies depending on from which side you see it. So from one kind of angle, which is from inside of this curve, it tries to articulate itself as a number of small, short tower blocks. And from the outside, it forms more of a bent lamellar curve. But if you look from above, you can see what it really does is that it picks up kind of the formal language of the old Olympic Stadium and mirrors it across the road. So in a sense, it's also part, like one of the last projects that comes out of sort of 80s or 90s, quite postmodern manierist take on planning in Stockholm, which is now completely replaced by things that look like this. So buildings that try to reproduce an image of a city that looks like a kind of a perimeter block city. This is a kind of a complex block in the sense that it clearly consists of other building typologies. So, for example, like 4 short tower blocks and 4 kind of lamellar buildings are joined in to form something that looks like a neighborhood sort of perimeter block. But looking at the construction system, it's clearly joined by other parts. And it's also articulated as separate smaller buildings. You can see here. I will flick through this. So the mullet, the mullet is very common. This is kind of what we produce. And it's basically a negotiator. It tries to produce a perimeter block city, or a kind of a walkable city, a city defined by a streetscape of streets, curbs, small plazas, and closed courtyards. But it's produced in predominantly the middle ring of Stockholm. So it has to negotiate this desire to produce a perimeter block city with other conditions. For example, like this, when you have like an area of single-family houses to one side and then a denser area to the other side. And they come in all forms and sizes. So because of, on one hand, a kind of plot sizes, and on the other hand, the kind of the building systems or the prefab concrete systems that almost all residential buildings in Sweden are built out of, it's hard to produce the closed perimeter block. And then these typologies form kind of all over the place. And I mean, they're interesting because the city that is actually produced is much more nuanced than the city that we talk about. Like in the Stockholm context, we very much talk about either kind of the suburbs, the modernist suburbs that are considered low class, and the kind of the inner city perimeter block city that is considered desirable.
And the reason why you call this the mullet, maybe?
Oh yeah, because on one side it's trying to produce like a neat streetscape, on the other side it's a bit freer and flowing. And the big baby being the kind of the disorderly last child in this gang is there's not so many of them. Out of these 150 something permits, there's about 10 of these. But they're very much indexing a moment in Stockholm where kind of real estate prices have soared to a high enough level so that it's now economically viable to redevelop plots designed for single-family housings, but that have kind of like a slightly generous envelope around them. And then we see houses such as this. So this particular house, we took a photo because it's also close to our office. But this is doing the kind of the gymnastics of fitting, I think it's is it 9 stories? 7-story building into a 2-story envelope. So this is a kind of a single-family housing plot designed, designated for a 2-story single-family house. And these are some more examples.
And I guess the big baby analogy comes from the fact that a 3-year-old and a like a 3-year-old and a 5-month-old are kind of the same thing, but not really. And this is the baby is trying very hard to be a 5-month-old, but not quite succeeding. Yeah, can we? So I'm going to start to wrap up and draw some conclusions here, I guess, by returning then to the interior. And the interior is interesting because it's the space where we confront ways of living, where we can start to see how these exterior gymnastics affect who we can be and the kind of lives that we can live. Karin likes memes. She put this in there. It's still there. So if what Rutger was explaining before was this kind of notion of complex forms emerging at the urban level, What we saw when we looked to the interior plans was fairly heavily regulated production lines for life, what we called linear living. And this is a really difficult field, I think, an argument to make, because in a sense, this is a critique of densification, which has become like a doctrine in our city at least. And I'm sure you've had enough yarn gale here in Melbourne to also be living under the densification doctrine. And obviously, sustainability is so incredibly important that we need to prioritise it. But when it comes to the point where it's sort of starting to result in market-driven shrinkage, we might ask who is it for and what kind of future generations are going to be living here. So some of the technologies of the densification of the interior then that we found in our late night forays through these thousands of PDFs were the wall of everything. I believe this is quite popular in a Melbourne context as well, but back in the 90s it was really quite the thing to have a show kitchen where you would make fancy food for your friends at a kitchen island, and this would be a sign of status and wealth in a Stockholm context. Now it's much more important to have a very, very, very straight kitchen. So here we see that the kitchen actually has become a kind of infrastructure. You walk into the hallway, the entree. You hang off all your jackets in the wardrobes there. You then continue on to your workplace, which during the pandemic you spent your entire life sitting at, which kind of carefully and easily moves into food preparation spaces, possibly some cleaning cupboards, and we end up in the bathroom with even the inclusion of the actual toilet in this kind of wall of infrastructure. And it's a really smart result of regulation, of playing with the regulations. If you have a kitchen, a bench that tries to take a corner, you end up having to use more space. So we're at a point of kind of maximisation here in our apartment designs, where even the slightest kink could cost you, several centimetres, which would throw your budget off. So here we see some examples of the linear kitchen, and what it does is it reorganises the apartment often in a tubular form. We do see it in larger apartments as well, where it's able to connect different spaces. It tucks things away. It's pretty neat. But it also results in an interior that's a little bit like a theatre stage, where everything gets put away at the end of the day, and the living room can then be used potentially for sleeping if you've got a studio apartment. We also saw some kind of statistical anomalies. So the 47 square metre apartment was a very common type, or it's a statistical mean actually. And when we look at what it does, here's a bunch of them. You'll see that we've been very careful to pull out our examples without naming or shaming particular architects. Also because, in a way, these are very good solutions to the problems posed, right? The thing with the 47 square metre apartment is you really have to choose what you're going to do with your life. And I mean this is not a great... we can't see everything here, but you get the idea. You can sleep in this apartment. You can put your child in the walk-in closet in this apartment. You can also store your winter tyres and ski gear in the closet with your child. You can use the bathroom, and you can cook for a limited number of guests who can sit around a very, very small dining table. What you can't do is have a hobby that is not on your computer, which would not be a problem for Rutger. You cannot build anything. You cannot make a mess. You cannot have a friend who comes and stays. You cannot have relatives who come and stay. You cannot have a housemate. You cannot have a messy life. You cannot have a lot of things. You need to be a fairly organised person to live in these spaces. And that's really what we're talking about as the social implications of shrinkage. Even in the bigger apartments, we see the optimisation of circulation spaces within apartments, taking away the possibility for mess or for deviation from norms. And that's what we trace it back in some ways to a maximisation of the regulations. But we also make the argument in the book that the regulations are the only thing left that are holding us back from, in fact, collapsing every space into the other, to the point where we're probably cooking whilst I don't know, not being on the toilet, but perhaps being in the shower. So we see these regulatory gymnastics coming to quite extreme limits. Here we have bedrooms where the bed is accessed via 2 sliding doors. So you have to walk around the bed into the living room to change sides of the bed. And changing sides of the bed isn't something we all need to do often, but if you're, for instance, ill and need a carer, this is something that your nurse would need to do. So, in fact, this is really pushing against our disabled access laws. And so, I guess to sum up this kind of interior analysis then, as we were sitting going through these plans, we've spent a lot of time at the office and we start to talk about them in terms of who sleeps with who. You get bored after a while in this kind of study and you start to imagine who may be sleeping with who in these imaginary apartments, but also maybe beyond the joke of like trying to make up sleazy romances based on 14,000 apartments, there's also a question of, what kind of life is really facilitated when we choose architectural norms that then become so heavily entrenched that there is no deviation from them. And in these images, you see a range of different larger apartments, and I won't go through each of them in detail without saying that there's sort of the general tendency is a master bedroom and 2 smaller bedrooms, which are clearly for children. The only possible alternative is you might have one of those smaller bedrooms being located near an entry, so it could be used for a study potentially, and those would have been the apartments that would have increased rapidly in value over the last 2 years because of the pandemic, of course. So we did a final kind of run through of our data, trying to look for apartments that would have 2 rooms that would support 2 double beds, as in 1 double bed in each room, in a desperate attempt to find a kind of co-living model. And we found 32 of them. That is 32 instances in our entire data set that would support living together with someone who is not your child. And that's pretty concerning, actually. So I guess when we look to these interior images and when we start to look to the regulations, we arrive at this insight, and it's really obvious, but it's also very nice to have empirical evidence to support it, that the minimum, in fact, has become the norm, that the absolute lowest grade of decency that we ask of our society becomes the thing that we will live in and with. And I think that's an interesting point to reflect on in relation to the current kind of efforts in a Melbourne context to regulate a higher density housing. So to conclude then, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. I'm just on a roll here. No, I'll finish up now. I love talking about this too much. It is kind of interesting to think about what housing does for us. We know that housing is access to adequate housing is part of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's instituted in the Swedish Constitution. It's something that we need as humans in order to survive, in order to flourish. And in the Swedish context, whilst we've reeled off a whole bunch of pretty boring statistics at you, these statistics intersect with politics, and we're seeing enormous demonstrations on the streets of Sweden at the moment related to the deregulation of the rental sector. The Swedish Prime Minister was essentially sacked in a parliamentary crisis over the marketisation of housing. And so these politics really come down to what we as a society believe is okay, reasonable, adequate, or in fact better than okay. The things that we've tried to kind of present to you in this very short run through of the book is the idea that architecture is a production of a future. And I think in that we see a very optimistic and affirmative role for the discipline, but also that architecture sometimes doesn't feel well. That architecture sometimes is, in fact, racked with anxieties, that it is asked to do very, very many things for very, very many people. And as a result, architecture at times can be evidence of a kind of collective nervous breakdown. We've also kind of posed to you this idea that maybe beyond the glossy best practice example that we see in our magazines, in our architectural discourse, that in fact the individual building might not be so interesting compared to its fabulous kind of alternative, which would be the composite beast. And at this point, I guess this is my last slide, but given that we did this project over 3 years, now these buildings are built. Now, in 2021, 2022, they're inhabited. So now would be the time for a kind of post-occupancy study. Now would be the point at which this would become not a projection, but archaeology. And so I hope that maybe archaeology might be a theme that we can return to in the discussion. But hopefully that gave you some insight into the contents of our book. And I'm very much looking forward to discussing it with our guests in the second half of this session. Thanks so much. Okay, let's Now it's the really nerve-wracking part because we've presented and now we've invited guests to comment on the project and also maybe to share their experiences and insights into this kind of scale of housing, because I think the point of doing a launch in Melbourne is not to kind of put forward the Swedish model or the outcomes of it as ideal or best practice or even kind of inspirational. It's rather to understand whether we are facing similar problems, how, and perhaps try to learn from each other on that level. I will introduce our esteemed panel. I was so happy to have the opportunity to discuss the work with local experts. I'm going to have to read my notes here, just 1 second. So Leanne Khor, you're a member of Monash Urban Lab. You develop design models for more affordable, sustainable housing and urban precincts, employing speculative design as a tool for navigating the complex and often conflicting imperatives of urban regeneration. And your research focuses on the quality and transformation of established suburbs operating across the scales of building, precinct and region. So thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. Lisa, sitting in the middle, Lisa Garner, co-founded the architecture practice Leanne, following a successful entry to the Victorian Government's Future Homes competition, an entry that has a solid fan base in the Stockholm context. When the results came out, we were really thrilled to look into your work and just to discover it, so thank you. She's currently involved in the delivery of the first demonstration project, which is 12 social housing units in Melbourne's western suburbs. And Lisa's particular interest lies in improving the livability and amenity of multi-residential design, which makes her perfect for this conversation. I think we share this. And your research spans across Melbourne and Berlin. You've worked on award-winning projects across all scales of residential development. So welcome and thank you. And finally, Alexis Kalagas is head of the, did I pronounce your last name correctly? I should have checked in with you there. Is head of the public programs at Molonglo and leads an advanced architecture studies unit at MADA. Previously a foreign policy advisor with the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, Alexis has worked on design and research projects across Europe, Latin America and Africa with the Zurich-based practice urban think tank. So thank you so much for joining us. And obviously, Secretary is here represented by Rutger and myself. So I think that it would be, given that the last kind of chapter that I presented was how to love housing without getting hurt, I'm like hinting at the fact that housing is an object, is an object that's hard to love sometimes, particularly, I mean, we all love our own home, but when we're looking at housing as an aggregate object, it becomes a kind of source of anxiety as much as it's a rich theme to mine. So I was hoping that perhaps we could start by just, with each of the panellists, just kind of introducing their relationship to housing. It's a little bit like a therapy session. Can put it all out there. Leanne, would we be able to start with you, perhaps?
Sure. Sure. My relationship to housing is very much academic based. So my research revolves around ideas of quality and affordability in the general housing market, and particularly for Melbourne. So I think that there is definitely a love-hate relationship there. Part of that is learning to love the suburbs as much as it is about learning to love housing, particularly when it can be of variable quality. And I think finding the kind of intelligences, let's say, is part of that love, not necessarily the aesthetic beauty.
And this maybe also touches on, for us, a kind of, I grew up in Melbourne but haven't lived here for a long time. Maybe a follow-up question that you could also deal with is the Australian relationship to apartment living. Is that one of love or fear, do we think?
I think that one's fraught. For me personally, probably one of love. I think that for Australia generally, a much harder conversation to probably have just historically and the way that settlement has happened here. I think that the detached house is so much part of the psyche of living that it's a different type of a conversation to the context in Stockholm.
Thank you. And Lisa, maybe you want to jump in and tell us about your relationship to housing? I know you're very busy, so it's probably a source of joy and anxiety at the same time right now in this point in your project.
Yeah. My relationship to housing, well, yeah, now it's professional, I guess, working on housing. But maybe the most defining thing is that working on housing for me feels like or working on good apartment housing in Melbourne feels like this kind of impossible challenge and a really important one. And for some reason, I think it's probably comes from living and working in Berlin and seeing a level of quality. But ever since then, all I've ever wanted to do is try and work on projects that lift the bar. Yeah, that's my relationship to it. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to hear these. We have the issue of the suburbs and this kind of fraught relationship, and then here the notion of almost impossibility. Alexis, do you share these feelings, or do you have a radically different kind of take on either your own professional work with housing or the Australian relationship to apartment living?
Well, I think those two questions are connected. But personally, I think everyone's relationship to housing is personal fundamentally. Even before you start working on anything to do with housing, you live in different types of housing and you understand the kind of challenges of different types of typologies, for example. But for me, it was very much shaped by a long time living in Zurich, and I think it's probably the first time I started to think about what good apartment living can be versus what we tend to get in Australia. And I had this kind of cognitive dissonance of travelling back and forth between Zurich and Melbourne and constantly starting to ask questions of what is going on here and why. But I think in terms of apartment living for Australians, I agree, it's completely part of the kind of Australian dream and the national myth, the detached house. But I also think it's really connected to tenure, and you can't really have a conversation about apartment living in Australia without having a conversation about rental housing versus owner-occupied housing, particularly because most apartments here are still investor stock. So.
I think we raised this issue of, and I guess this language around trying to sort of we're trying to not fetishize housing as an object, but we're trying to also establish a more romantic relationship with it as an object. And I think this is really difficult at the moment in terms of, in architectural theory, we're seeing a real turn towards care, I think, would be an insight I've had. And the care discourse is very important because it brings us to notions of repair, of how we inhabit a shared life together. But it also clashes to some extent with universal understandings of access, because from a Swedish perspective, the rental housing has always been non-means tested, which means it's not public housing, it's not social housing, it's there, and then if you have socioeconomic difficulties, you would apply for subsidies that would kind of help you access it. And so we're seeing in Sweden a move now where public housing is being introduced, which sounds like a great idea, but it's also an erosion of this sort of universal system that we've previously had. Rutger, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I mean, it's interesting to reflect on that. Do you think that housing is something that we should individually care about, or from a Swedish perspective, are you more interested in the universal provision kind of angle, or both and?
Hello, yes. Maybe we could individually care about it as a collective resource. I mean, it's... I think with the book, I mean, like we wrote a book about it, so it's a bit of an issue for us to think about this concept. But it's I think the idea of visualizing it as a kind of a beast with many heads, or like plans after plans after plans, is also to kind of, as architects, we always design apartments for others, right? And sometimes we do this kind of black hole of narcissism that we call our own house, you know. But mainly it's for other people. And I think it's important to look at it and think that we might, you know, get to live there or have to live there at some point. And maybe that's a way of looking at it, I think. You know, if housing could be for everybody, and if that house like that could be nice.
Nice housing. This is our next book. Because I think something we're really trying to deal with here is a quantitative problem also. We spend quite a lot of time in the introduction to the book discussing housing shortage, which is a quantitative issue of supply not meeting demand. But on a personal level, this is also lives being ruined, right? This is years of living on, or months, hopefully, of living on other people's couches. This is trying to get together short-term solutions in order to just wake up somewhere safe. And this quantitative issue, has these enormous kind of societal impacts. In the Swedish context, there's a housing shortage that was the background to why we produced so many apartments in such a short period of time, was also heavily racialized through its link to the immigration crises and the influx of Syrian refugees. So it's an extremely complicated kind of scenario that we're facing. But as kind of outsiders, housing shortage, is this something, or housing crisis, are these also issues that are being faced in the Melbourne context, and are they being posed as policy questions? And if so, who is to meet them?
Take it, you're doing it.
I guess, I mean, it's quite different on the topic of social and public housing. There's been a huge push in terms of policy and funding to build a lot more social housing over the next 5 to 10 years, and that's what we're working on. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's also a sensitive topic in terms of the sites that have been chosen, and a lot of the sites are existing social housing, and there's a lot of complexities in how new social housing is built together with market housing, and it's definitely a big topic right now.
And is this something that's sort of echoing through the planning discourse? I mean, is this a policy issue, or is this coming from a market kind of perspective of like meeting demand?
I'm going to answer this not as an architect or a planner or as someone who works in
Perfect.
policy.
That's why you're here.
But I mean, I think the crisis here, maybe it's not one of supply, it's a crisis of affordability, I think. I mean, house prices have gone up by 25% in the last 12 months during a pandemic when we had no immigration. So the kind of myth that it's all about, it's all been driven by immigration was really exposed as being a myth. And I think that, there's a lot of investment now in social and affordable housing from the government side, but it's reacting to a problem that's been caused by the market. Like, I don't think... there was underinvestment for a long time in social housing in Australia and in Melbourne, but that investment, the value of it increases when the affordability of everything else starts to drop even further.
Yeah, I think it's probably both still, though. I think supply is still an issue of type. And so what's really great about the book is understanding where and how the different housing types are being delivered. Because absolutely that it's affordability, and it always gets couched in this idea of supply because it's so speculative in Melbourne, the housing market's so speculative in Melbourne. But then when you look at what is deemed as affordable and where it's being delivered in Melbourne, that becomes part of the affordability conversation. So I think going back then to what you were asking in terms of universal housing versus public housing and all of these sorts of things, the fact that there's been an undersupply of social and affordable housing in Melbourne and public housing in Melbourne has also taken away the responsibility of the market in some senses to deal with it in a good and or providing good and good quality housing, not just numbers of housing, if that makes any sense.
And in a Swedish context, the responsibility for the provision of housing is devolved to the municipal level. And we see a kind of situation where municipalities, and this is very common in a range of different international contexts, but municipalities are competing for certain kinds of voters that are associated with certain forms of housing, and thus the forms of housing that are associated with the voters that they do not want are not being built. So this is like politics is sort of being expressed typologically. The tower block that Rutger showed, for instance, is notoriously problematic in conservative municipalities because it concentrates so many bodies so quickly, like slurp, and then suddenly these people don't own housing and are not going to vote for policies perhaps that support private property, defence of private property. So it becomes this kind of really competitive local geopolitics. Does Melbourne have the same kind of fracturing in terms of various municipalities, or is the Victorian planning system delivering some kind of consistency?
The fracturing, absolutely, I think. I think, though, I mean, there are lots of big issues that you're raising there. It's pretty hard to unpack. But I think that it does go to sort of the issue of wealth accumulation and that role of housing, as opposed to housing being a home, all of those sorts of issues. And then I guess the political mobility of people who have accumulated wealth and those sorts of things being able to direct, let's say, the types of built form that then is allowed at local government level or at state government level.
I mean, maybe I could follow up, though, just continuing on this typology obsession that you guys may have noticed we have. I think it's interesting to ask you whether this tendency that Rutger was sketching towards a kind of complexification from a set of really standard kit of parts building types towards something that is far more messier, far more badly behaved, perhaps much more interesting, definitely more complex, definitely bigger, thicker, wider, taller, but also kind of extended in 3 dimensions over like parking garages and occupying odd sites. Is this complexification something that resonates with the Australian context? Because I'm not clear whether Australia's ever had those strong typologies to start with.
I think that there was a bit of clarity in the 60s of walk-up flats, which is so admirable about them. But it's definitely the case here when you look at new apartment buildings that there is so much complexity and kind of ad hocism, which I think just comes out of feeling the maximum planning envelope. Like there is no scope to kind of think about a form that you want to create. It's just what can we fit in there, and then along the way, complexities come in and things just evolve, and you reach certain milestones, and you can't sort of go back and reevaluate whether it's actually a good outcome. You just have to keep going, and it's it's a challenging environment to create something simple and true to an idea. Yeah.
I'll just add as well. I mean, I think it's interesting to see some of those examples that you showed where I think he called it the fragmented block, trying to kind of fit in with the perimeter block, like historic fabric. And to me, we kind of lack a historic fabric of medium density in many parts of Melbourne, most parts of Melbourne. And so, if you look at places like Brunswick, where you have quite high density that is just dropped in, it's really more about getting away with these really abrupt transitions to freestanding houses rather than trying to fit into some existing urban fabric that doesn't really match the density of what's been built now.
Yeah, I think Lisa brings up a sort of really good point in the sense that the envelope plays a really big role here. So what struck me from your presentation is that we don't necessarily have the same size development sites, let's say, on scale in terms of them being, racked up next to each other. So where you're talking about regulations forcing a kind of a form from the inside out, I think it very much plays potentially the other direction here, and then it's a density game or a numbers game outside in. So it's a sort of a different mess, I guess.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that the average square metre plot size was 5,000 square metres.
Yeah, there's a lot of empty space on those 5,000 square meters. But I guess, it should also be mentioned that Sweden doesn't have the kind of the performance-based planning regulation, in the sense we have the heritage of the modernist system. So we have something called the detail plan, which is quite actually designed building envelope that's usually developed when in kind of parallel with the developments. And that's much more kind of coordinated towards these typologies that existed. So what we can see in the Swedish typologies is this kind of you have this kind of typological core that gives it a sort of a reason or a mandate to exist. And then a kind of a regulatory minimum. And then this outer shape indexing kind of property values, basically trying to push and get into the right shapes. And then an outside kind of decoration that tries to index certain aesthetic ideals of what a walkable city means. So Swedish irrationality is very functional in that sense.
Maybe this is a cheeky question, but I don't know, if you've lived outside of Melbourne for 15 years and you return and you're driving or walking or taking a tram through the kind of inner city, I think we see this incredible complexity in facade detailing, which seems, if we're going to psychoanalyze anything, fairly irrational, maybe a little deranged even. This articulation that is trying to kind of produce streetscape, I guess. But what's it hiding? Why is it so nervously trying to distract us?
It's trying to descale mass unsuccessfully.
Because I think in that we actually see a different answer to the same question that Rutger was trying to pose, in Sweden, this anxiety around creating cohesive city images of a city when you have buildings that are far too big to actually do that. So perhaps I don't know if we want to take home the facade articulation from Melbourne and suggest it as an alternate possibility, but perhaps. So I think I'd also, I guess, like to ask you, because you've seen the book a little bit and now you've sort of seen us try to explain it in a relatively short amount of time, but was there anything, because the book is also an archive that provides just the raw data to everybody who wants to formulate their own opinion on it, it would be interesting to ask whether there was anything that stuck out as completely crazy or strange in these developments that deviated so strongly from how things are done in Melbourne that you think it would be worth raising this, because now would be the time when we can unpick those weirdnesses. I can kind of give an example, for instance, when we did the Future Homes competition, that Karen and Rutger were both confused by some things in the Australian situation, why do we have so many toilets? Or bedrooms are a minimum of 3 across. Look how big these bedrooms are. We had these kind of like moments where we encountered these like odd other standards that produce something else. So in looking through the book, was there anything that stood out that looked particularly odd, strange, interesting?
It kind of came more out of our conversation, but I was pretty amazed to hear that there's no requirement for an outdoor space for an apartment in Sweden, because that sort of it's such a big driver of apartment design in Melbourne. Just news to me.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the same thing. I think the role of the balcony in the apartments, I think that trying to get reasonable sized balconies has only been a recent thing in Melbourne, but I think just, I don't know, perhaps climate or whatever it is, the messy spaces and the other things that you were bringing up to kind of make a dwelling, a home, kind of an issue. I think sometimes that mess spills out onto the balcony here, and I think that that's probably, in terms of the functional Swedish design you're bringing up, perhaps one of those things, that there's a bit of flex space or looseness with a balcony that perhaps doesn't play out in some of the dwellings you've been showing.
I guess one of the games with balcony design, this is very nerdy, but would be the problem of getting light in a situation where we have almost total darkness and almost total light, trying to deal with these sun angles, and a balcony will always deprive your main living space of direct sun. So there's a kind of game there that's really calculation driven. I should continue with this question. Was there any other anomalies that we need to deal with?
It's probably less question about detail, but more, did you find the different tenures or ownership models were driving different types of products?
This question has been asked every single time we have presented the book in any form, and not really. Like I think the average apartment size is 2 square meters larger if it's like a cooperatively owned compared to a rental one. But also because of depending on how the economy or the economics are doing, kind of they would switch sides. So if the economy is overheating in one way, it's more suitable to do kind of co-op privately owned, or if it's going in the other way, those could kind of be changed to rentals. So there's also a certain sense of flexibility there. But I think in both cases, they're pushing quite tightly against the bare minimum. So then there's less difference. Like you would have a nicer SMEG kind of refrigerator in the co-op or nicer flooring, but on a floor plan they're very similar.
Another a follow-up book, next time we can be bothered doing a 3-year research project again, would be to look, of course, at the detailing and the materials. I mean, the plans we're looking at are fairly stripped back. So, I think we'd see the differences in the marble bench tops, in the Khor nice kind of brass fittings, or the leather strap that seems to be very popular on kitchen doors in Sweden right now. It would be at those quite superficial levels. We didn't see any huge.
One slightly paradoxical thing is that we could see that there are kind of typically more shared amenities in the cooperatively owned ones than in the rental ones, which for a Swedish kind of situation is slightly seems strange. Traditionally you would have a laundry room and these things in rental apartments, but I guess it's also because kind of privately owned housing is so much about the sales brochure, and the sales brochure is 95% images of coffee shops that could be in your area. They're typically kind of stock photos. So, and then these kind of shared spaces, such as a lobby or a shared terrace, actually turns into value, whereas they don't really in a rental situation. Then they're just a cost.
I think it would also be nice to allow the audience to pose any questions. I assume that for sound purposes, I probably should bring, if you yell out, I'll repeat the question into the mic, might be the best way to go. But I did want to open up just in case anyone has a burning question about contemporary Swedish apartment design that they must have answered before they go home to bed tonight. Or about the method of the study as well, which we made up as we went along. Yeah, yes, at the back.
Just a question around the floor areas, particularly the one-bedroom apartments that you were looking at, which were sort of the 47 to, I think was the norm rather than the 50. And you touched on some of the very small apartments having sort of bedrooms with a wall at the end and then two access points. From a Swedish point of view, what is the sort of aging in place or disability type standard that's required? I mean, we in Australia are about to sort of be forced into sort of liberal standard guidelines for in the new sort of edition of the building code. What exists in Sweden? Because that, from our perspective, drives apartment sizes from our perspective.
That's a great question. So just to repeat it into the mic, the question was related to access standards and ageing in place as an issue, and what kind of regulations are driving these spatial requirements at the level of the apartment.
I mean, there's a fairly extensive regulations text about concerning accessibility. It's not specific for aging, but then there's a set of kind of standards, which were these kind of drawn out symbols that Helen showed previously, and the standards are more kind of agreement if you don't want to go through the kind of the hassle of proving that you could access this or that. They're kind of generally agreed upon by municipalities and developers to work. But typically, like, it's this kind of, there's this offsets. So if you have a bed, you know, there's an offset in various directions that you need around it in order to access it, and that grows depending on the size of the household. And specifically with this 47 square meters, is that like a fairly recent kind of addition to the regulations is that if one bedroom apartments are of 55 square meters or below, they're counted as an apartment where one person lives rather than two. And that means that all the like accessibility measurements are drawn out from symbols with like smaller furniture. And then typically in a real estate ad, it would be furnished with larger furniture. So that produces this small furniture. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
But I think one thing that I'd like to add there would be that we wrote this book also in defence of these regulations, that a lot of Swedish architects are highly critical of the size of bathrooms. And there's a conversation that's very, very common around, that goes along the lines of, I could have done a much better plan if I could have made a much smaller bathroom. And that's a very kind of standard thing you hear. But at the same time, from our practice's perspective at least, we would defend the right to pee if you need to pee, no matter whose house you're at, if you're in a wheelchair. It seems pretty basic. And so for us, that conversation seems really, really problematic. At the same time, I think we're seeing the market push so hard against these minimums. So we have corridor width, for instance, requirements, as do many countries, but we're seeing a situation where wheelchair rooms are being provided at the lower level, where you switch to an indoor wheelchair, which has a slightly smaller dimension in order to allow for tighter corridors. So we're seeing ways of getting around this at the moment. And our argument would be, where is there ever the moment where you push back and say, no, we're going to be more generous? Is there ever a possibility where we would raise the minimum ceiling height? Is there ever a moment where we would collectively take to the streets in order to argue for 1.4, 1.6, 1.8 metre wide corridors? When do we mobilise for greater spatial equity rather than for reductions? And that's a huge question. Is this something that our panellists would see in the contemporary conversation around access requirements or spatial minimums?
Yeah, I mean, we've been working to the livable housing design guidelines, probably what the question was referring to, and there's sort of different standards. And so for the social housing project. It's a gold standard, which is 1,200 corridors and 1,200 in front of all toilets and showers. And it's definitely, it puts a lot of pressure on the design, and it is a lot of area, which is the biggest cost of the project. But I think you're right when you say that everyone should be able to use a bathroom. So I guess it's just going to become the new industry norm, but it's definitely hard. And it is a lot of area. I think proportionally, especially a one-bedroom apartment, the bathroom and the bedroom are now bigger than the living room through access requirements.
I think another way of thinking about it too is what it would cost, not necessarily in terms of floor area in the initial kind of provision of universal access and those sorts of things, but what it costs to then adapt for later when it is needed. So I think it's just sort of shifting the equation a little bit from the lettable area to the cost of living and the cost of adapting and so forth and so forth. So I think others at Monash, not myself, but others at Monash are doing a lot of work in terms of retrofitting and that sort of stuff. So not just in terms of dignified living, but I think also just the logic of what that means when we don't do it properly in the first place. It's actually a big impact.
I think we're kind of coming towards the end of we've got a couple of minutes left. Is there anyone else who'd like to pose a question from the audience? Great.
Do you guys think observationally from Australia's point of view that traditional notion of high density is being up, whereas when we interface with the suburban extension or the suburban sprawl where I probably perceive high density as also close proximity, going back to that, the dream of that detached dwelling, do you think that Australia potentially, in comparison to what seems like a very functional, consistent typology that's presented in the book, do you think Australia is still very much experimenting with what the definition of high density is?
Just the question for the recording was, is Australia still experimenting with the kind of fundamental question of what high density is? Maybe this is a good one for the panellists, I feel.
Start. You've done a bit of this.
I mean, I think it's a good question. But I think also if you look at who lives in apartments now, for example, it's very unrepresentative of the population at large. I mean, I think I did some research for a project in the past, and I think the top 10 LGAs in Australia in terms of families living in apartments are all in Sydney, and the top in Melbourne is the area that encompasses the CBD, and it's something like 7% of apartments have families. So, I mean, I think we can't talk about density in Australia as a kind of mass phenomenon if we're not actually talking about how most people live. I think there's problems of thinking about density in terms of like adding intensity to suburbs. I think, you know, even just from my mother lives in Mont Albert North, for example, and there's just in her street, it's like one block after another has been built out to the boundaries, and you lose all the amenity and all the reasons that people actually want to live in the suburbs. I think if you allow that, but then I know that, like at Monash, for example, there's a lot of work that's been done around more sensitive ways of adding density in the suburbs. So, yeah, I don't know. I think there's two different conversations that are probably connected in many ways.
I think it's a really good observation. Like, I guess we really are still working out a way to densify, and it's an interesting challenge. I think particularly densifying the suburbs is the hardest challenge that we're facing, and that's something that the Future Homes project that I'm working on is trying to address. It's about unlocking apartment typologies in the suburbs of 3 stories, but with much more open space around them, as opposed to these kind of dual occ sort of townhouse densifications that are happening all over the suburbs. So I feel like there's a lot of potential in that, but yeah, I guess we're still working it out.
I agree. I think we are definitely experimenting, and I think that in a way it'd be nice to perhaps shift the conversation. I think there's such a long history of thinking about towers, and there's a whole stigma attached to those and all of that kind of stuff, but be interesting to shift the conversation to what are the good things that can happen with density, as opposed to necessarily let's kind of conservatively approach density.
Yeah, I think it's important to, it's not the time or the place to give this kind of history of Swedish urban planning, but my maybe final comment then. No, I just think that many of the housing typologies that Rutger showed, especially from the post-war period, the 50s, were formulated on the basis of demands that came from the workers' movement, and that it was a bottom-up kind of demand for housing and for dignified housing. If we're going to use our bodies in the service of capital, you will provide us with somewhere to lay our heads at night. And I think that bottom-up demand for housing is incredibly important. It crystallised in a series of very standardised products that were deemed okay. But the whole kind of point of our book, in one way, was to try to just produce one tiny little evidence base that might be used in order to pose demands potentially from the architect's perspective. And I think that that's the key to this whole conversation, is who is formulating the demand for housing and how can we back that up with research?
I think it's another interesting thing when you brought up the number of, let's say, authors for the development, either the fewer number of developers producing this stuff, or even actually by comparison to here, the few number of architects authoring the work. So I guess I wondered whether or not, as part of this, is there ever a situation where there are sort of multiple architects working on one development, given the scale shift we were talking about? Or what do you guys think is the role of the architect in terms of arguing for a different outcome?
I think, we're doing one of those houses right now, or there's 3 offices collaborating. But in the book, it's typically, we can see that the house typically has more authors because one architecture office was kicked out and then one other was brought in, typically around permitting. And it's within kind of competitions in the Scandinavian context, it's highly desired for big and boring offices to team up with slightly hipper outfits to produce like a palpable sort of mix. Like it's easier to get in, but it's unfavorable, I would say, economically. Like the way the system, at least, or in a Stockholm setup works, is that it's done when there's outside pressure, typically.
I think as a result of the welfare state history of housing production, that we have very, very, very big design offices in Sweden. So we're talking, there's 4 major kind of offices that rank, that did most of this. And they are 400 to 500 people sitting in a room pushing out this stuff. And this book was also a bit of a love letter to them. It wasn't a critique of all those architects sitting there just trying their damn best under really, really tight market kind of pressures and extremely combative and politically difficult relationship with the planning system. So in a way, I guess we need to sort of wrap up, but the book for us was the desire to really show that labour and that work, because it never ever enters the covers of architecture magazines, and in some ways it was okay. Everyone did what they were meant to do and everyone decided, this is okay, we can build this. And so we sort of put that on the table with maybe the provocative kind of follow-up question of, okay, but what would be more than okay? So I think that was...
Should I? Yeah, I mean, like we typically, like if we give this kind of talk for architecture offices, we typically get this question of like, yeah, but what should we do? And it's like, maybe unionize? Or I mean, like this idea of, like it's a collective endeavor and it's not going to solve by individual efforts, right? So there needs to be, or at least in a Swedish context, there needs to be some kind of way of organizing a discussion for alternatives that is not, that does not reside within an individual kind of market relationship, I think.
Right. So that's a question on that. Because I mean, I think there's obviously, you can talk about planning frameworks and kind of the dynamics of the market coming from the developer perspective, but you showed some images of people protesting, and I think there is also like some responsibility, even if you think about Australia, like why do we have 2 bathrooms in every apartment? That's because there's this perceived resale value that you need two bathrooms, and if your apartment is like your biggest investment, you're going to make, like, you want to protect your investment, and so actually, like, people, there's a perceived demand for that that's shaping the brief. Do you think these types of apartment plans are actually responding to a demand in the market in Sweden, or if they're not, why they're being produced?
No, but they are. But that market is also, I mean, there's it's not a shortage of residential units if you can pay a lot of money. But there's never a shortage for anybody who can pay a lot. But yeah, I would say that the apartments we're seeing very accurately diagram kind of the real estate economics of Stockholm. And it's also kind of a subsidized, like, it's not a free market in any way or form. There's a municipal planning monopoly. So every piece of land is planned, or at least is approved through the municipal planning machine, and it's part of those policies. But
I love the idea of the municipal planning machine.
Or like the system. But I mean, it's also this, I mean, for example, within the region of Stockholm, and this has shifted during the last maybe 3 or 2 decades, a majority now own their own apartments, and 30 years ago, a majority rented. And that is a way to shift the electoral constituency. So that also means that you have a much more articulatedly right-wing kind of voter group in Stockholm, and Stockholm is also kind of like a right-wing seat at the moment. And so like these also connect into, I mean, if a majority of the people living in Stockholm own their own apartment, they're not going to vote for a politics that would reduce the value of those apartments or houses, especially if you're not mortgaged up to that level already. And so although the machinery of kind of post-war Sweden, the institutions, in order to produce kind of like the million program apartments that are kind of state subsidized, built by municipal housing companies in the 60s, like it's kind of in place still. There's not the political will to do that. So in a sense, we're locked into a bad situation because of demand.
I hear that my laptop is beeping that it's on very low battery, and it feels that that's quite good timing in a way, because we have actually arrived at 3 minutes past 2. I would like to thank, firstly, the people in the room who have had something to do with the production of this book. So I named Tristan Main earlier, and Charles Eyre, thank you for your proofreading. That was very important to me at that point, at the last moment possible. But also just to acknowledge the contribution of Karin Matz, who's not here today, who's the 3rd author, who's had an enormous impact on this work. We'd also like to thank Euro Books for the possibility to be here and for supporting this event, the audience who've given up their Saturday afternoon to plunge into the Swedish housing market with us, and finally, and perhaps most of all, the 3 panellists who've agreed to join us and try to pick apart some of these incredibly complex issues in a very short amount of time in front of an audience. So Leanne, Lisa, Alexis, thank you for joining us. I think it's a wrap.